September 15, 2023, Greenwood, Indiana. The morning sunlight barely filtered through the dense fog that clung to the small suburban neighborhood. Paul Mitchell gripped his car keys tightly as he stepped out of his sedan, still groggy from his weekend trip to Bloomington. A nagging feeling had followed him during the entire drive home, a strange, inexplicable heaviness that refused to lift. The Mitchell house, a modest two-story in a quiet cul-de-sac, stood eerily silent as Paul approached. Normally, his mother, Barbara, would be at the door, eager to greet him with her usual blend of warmth and mild overbearing concern. Today, there was only stillness. He shook his head, blaming his unease on the lingering stress of college deadlines. Unlocking the door, Paul stepped inside. The faint scent of coffee lingered in the air, a hint of normalcy that momentarily reassured him. "Mom?" "Laura," he called out, his voice echoing faintly in the empty house. The silence that followed was deafening. As he walked into the kitchen, Paul's world tilted. At first, he didn't fully register the scene in front of him. Shards of broken glass glittered on the floor, the kitchen table was overturned, and in the middle of it all lay Laura Hayes. Her once lively face was pale and still, framed by a pool of dark red spreading beneath her head. The jagged remains of a porcelain vase lay scattered around her lifeless body. Paul froze, his breath catching in his throat. His mind screamed at him to move, to do something, but his body refused to obey. "Laura," he whispered, the word trembling on his lips. He dropped to his knees, shaking her shoulder as if he could will her back to life. Her skin was cold, unresponsive. The realization hit him like a freight train. She was gone. Fumbling for his phone, Paul managed to dial 911, his fingers trembling violently. "There's been an accident, or something," he stammered to the dispatcher, his voice cracking. "It's my girlfriend. She's not breathing." The minutes stretched into eternity until the distant sound of sirens broke the oppressive silence. Paul paced the living room, his mind a chaotic swirl of disbelief, fear, and guilt. How could this have happened? Who would hurt Laura? His mother's absence gnawed at the edges of his thoughts, but he pushed it aside, focusing instead on the immediate nightmare. When the paramedics arrived, they confirmed what Paul already knew but couldn't accept. Laura Hayes was dead. The police followed close behind, their presence transforming the quiet Mitchell home into a crime scene. Questions rained down on Paul as officers meticulously documented the scene. One question stood out, piercing through Paul's haze of grief: "Where is your mother?" Barbara's absence was as glaring as the blood-stained floor. Paul stammered an answer, his voice faltering as doubt crept in. He hadn't seen or heard from his mother since before the trip. A cold dread settled in his chest as he realized he had no idea where she was, or what she might know about the horror that had unfolded in their home. Standing in the middle of the chaos, Paul felt the weight of an unspoken truth pressing down on him. Something wasn't right. And as the officers worked to unravel the mystery, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Barbara Mitchell wasn't always a woman weighed down by loneliness. A decade ago, she had been the quintessential suburban mom, devoted to her son Paul, active in the local community, and deeply invested in maintaining the appearance of a perfect family. But appearances, as Barbara knew all too well, could be deceiving. The cracks in her marriage began long before the divorce papers were signed in January 2022. Her husband's long hours at work had turned into absences she couldn't ignore. And when the truth came out, that he had been unfaithful for years, it wasn't just the marriage that shattered. Barbara's sense of self crumbled with it. After the divorce, Barbara moved into a smaller house in Greenwood, Indiana, trading her previous life of social gatherings and PTA meetings for nights spent staring at the empty walls of her living room. Paul, her only child, became her anchor. She poured all her energy into him, calling him daily, cooking elaborate meals when he visited, and filling the void left by her husband's betrayal with her son's presence. But Paul was busy carving out his own life. A pre-law student at Indiana University in Bloomington, he juggled coursework, internships, and a budding romance with Laura Hayes. His trips home became less frequent, and although he never said it outright, Barbara sensed his growing discomfort with her overbearing attention. It was in May 2022 that Paul introduced Laura to Barbara. From the moment Laura stepped through the door, Barbara felt a mixture of admiration and envy. Laura was everything Barbara once prided herself on being: young, beautiful, and full of energy. Her presence was like a breath of fresh air in the Mitchell home, temporarily lifting Barbara out of her gloom. Laura, in turn, seemed eager to connect. She laughed at Barbara's jokes, complimented her cooking, and genuinely appeared to enjoy their conversations. But Barbara's interest in Laura quickly became something more than friendly. At first, it was subtle, an extra effort to make Laura feel welcome, small gifts, just because, and long chats whenever Paul wasn't around. By the fall of 2022, Barbara began to crave Laura's presence in a way that felt new, even unsettling. She told herself it was harmless. After all, wasn't it natural to want to be close to someone so vibrant? Yet the more time they spent together, the more Barbara realized she wasn't just seeing Laura as her son's girlfriend. She was seeing her as someone who filled the emotional void left by her failed marriage. Paul, oblivious to his mother's growing attachment, saw Laura's relationship with Barbara as a blessing. He was relieved that the two most important women in his life got along so well. But Laura began to sense that Barbara's attention was crossing boundaries. What started as casual compliments evolved into deeply personal remarks, about Laura's appearance, her perfume, the way her laughter brightened the room. By early 2023, the dynamic in the Mitchell household shifted. Paul's visits home were less about catching up with his mother and more about ensuring Laura didn't feel uncomfortable. Barbara, meanwhile, became more possessive. When Paul and Laura made plans without including her, Barbara would retreat into silence, her disappointment radiating through every interaction. It wasn't long before Barbara's jealousy turned toward Paul himself. She resented how much time he spent with Laura, how effortlessly Laura seemed to capture his attention. Barbara's longing for connection deepened, morphing into an obsession that she struggled to hide. Laura confided in Paul about her unease. "Your mom's intense," she said one evening after dinner. "I think she means well, but sometimes it feels like she doesn't want me here for you. She wants me here for her." Paul brushed it off, insisting that his mother was simply lonely. But Laura's instincts told her otherwise. Barbara, however, wasn't oblivious. She noticed Laura pulling away, sensed the growing tension, and doubled down on her efforts to keep her close. Invitations to stay for dinner turned into pleas to stay overnight. Gifts became more extravagant, including a necklace that Barbara insisted looked like it was made for you. Laura thanked her politely but began to avoid being alone with her. As Barbara's attachment to Laura intensified, so did her desperation to maintain the fragile balance of their relationship. And while Paul remained largely unaware of the storm brewing in his mother's mind, Laura began to realize that the dynamic in the Mitchell household wasn't just strained, it was dangerously unbalanced. The three of them, mother, son, and girlfriend, were trapped in a web of unspoken emotions, each thread stretched tighter with every interaction. And beneath it all, the seeds of a devastating conflict were beginning to take root. By early February 2023, the delicate balance in the Mitchell household began to unravel. What once seemed like a harmonious relationship between Barbara and Laura had turned into something far more complicated and tense. Beneath the surface of their interactions lay a growing strain that neither Paul nor Laura could ignore. Barbara's attention toward Laura escalated. She began texting Laura directly, often under the guise of checking in or sharing seemingly innocent updates about the house. While Paul dismissed these as harmless acts of kindness, Laura couldn't shake the discomfort that came with Barbara's overly personal messages. They weren't just updates, they were invitations, requests for validation, and sometimes, subtle hints of disapproval if Laura didn't respond quickly enough. One evening in late February, Barbara invited Laura over for dinner, insisting that Paul stay at the university to finish a late project. Laura hesitated but agreed, hoping the evening would be uneventful. Instead, it turned into a night she couldn't forget. Over wine and a carefully prepared meal, Barbara shared stories from her past, stories that grew increasingly personal, even confessional. "I envy you," Barbara said suddenly, her voice soft but tinged with something darker. "You have this energy, this light about you. I used to have that, you know. Before everything fell apart." Laura froze, unsure how to respond. She felt the weight of Barbara's gaze, the intensity of her words, and the unspoken emotions that seemed to linger between them. Barbara reached across the table, placing her hand lightly on Laura's. "You remind me of myself. Back when I still felt alive." Laura pulled her hand back, laughing nervously to diffuse the moment. "That's kind of you to say, Barbara," she said, deliberately avoiding eye contact. The rest of the evening was a blur, but Laura left with a knot in her stomach. She didn't tell Paul about what happened, unsure how to explain the shift in Barbara's behavior without sounding paranoid. As the months passed, Barbara's obsession became harder to ignore. She began leaving small, thoughtful gifts for Laura, flowers, books, even a scarf she claimed matched her eyes. Laura tried to distance herself, but Barbara's persistence made it nearly impossible. When Laura politely declined invitations to visit, Barbara would call her, sometimes in tears, apologizing profusely for being too much and begging her not to pull away. Meanwhile, Paul, caught up in his studies and career ambitions, failed to see the cracks forming in the relationships around him. He noticed Laura becoming quieter, more withdrawn, but chalked it up to stress. Barbara, for her part, masked her growing desperation with an air of maternal affection, playing the role of the doting mother when Paul was around. The tipping point came in June 2023. Barbara, sensing Laura's growing unease, began taking more drastic measures. She started prying into Laura's life, asking pointed questions about her family, her past, and her relationship with Paul. When Laura was evasive, Barbara's frustration boiled over into passive-aggressive comments and guilt-laden remarks. It was during one of these moments that Laura discovered something unsettling. While helping Barbara clean the house, she stumbled upon a drawer filled with items she hadn't given much thought to before: an empty perfume bottle that matched the scent she often wore, a framed photo of her and Paul from their anniversary dinner, and, most disturbingly, a handwritten note addressed to her. The note was raw, emotional, and deeply personal. It spoke of admiration, longing, and a desperate fear of being abandoned. "You make me feel alive again," it read. "Please don't leave. I don't think I could bear it." Laura's heart raced as she realized the extent of Barbara's attachment. This wasn't just a case of a lonely woman clinging to her son's girlfriend for companionship. It was something far deeper, and far darker. That evening, Laura confronted Paul. She tried to explain what she had found, how uncomfortable Barbara's behavior had made her, but Paul dismissed her concerns. "She's just lonely, Laura," he said, his voice edged with defensiveness. "She's been through a lot. Don't make it into something it's not." But Laura couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread. She began to pull back, visiting less frequently and limiting her interactions with Barbara. This only made things worse. Barbara, feeling the distance, became more erratic. She started showing up unannounced at Laura's workplace, sending long, rambling text messages late at night, and even dropping cryptic hints to Paul about Laura's true feelings. In August 2023, Barbara took her manipulation to a new level. Using an anonymous number, she sent Paul a message claiming that Laura was seeing someone else. The message was vague but effective, planting seeds of doubt in Paul's mind. When he confronted Laura, she denied everything, but the damage was done. The trust between them began to erode, and Laura found herself more isolated than ever. By the end of the summer, the tension in the Mitchell household was palpable. Barbara's desperation to keep Laura close had turned into a suffocating obsession, and Laura's attempts to distance herself only fueled Barbara's paranoia. The fragile relationships between mother, son, and girlfriend were nearing their breaking point, and beneath the surface, a storm was brewing that none of them could stop. By September 2023, the Mitchell household was a powder keg waiting to explode. The tension between Barbara, Laura, and Paul had grown unbearable, with each strained interaction adding fuel to the fire. Barbara's desperation, Laura's fear, and Paul's obliviousness created a toxic mix of emotions that could no longer be contained. It began to unravel on the evening of September 14, 2023. Laura, having spent weeks agonizing over Barbara's increasingly erratic behavior, decided it was time to end things, for good. She hadn't told Paul yet, but in her mind, she had made up her mind. She needed to cut ties with both him and his mother to regain her peace. That night, she drove to the Mitchell house to deliver her decision, unaware of the storm brewing inside. Barbara, as if sensing Laura's intentions, greeted her at the door with an unusual calmness. The house was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Paul wasn't home. Barbara had made sure of that by urging him to stay late at the university, claiming she needed some girl time with Laura. As Laura stepped inside, the weight of Barbara's gaze made her stomach churn. There was something unnerving in the way Barbara moved, the way she lingered too close as they walked into the kitchen. On the counter sat an open bottle of wine and 2 glasses, an invitation that Laura was quick to decline. "We need to talk," Laura said, her voice steady but firm. Barbara froze, the glass she had been holding trembling slightly in her hand. "Talk about what?" she asked, her tone laced with forced cheer. Laura took a deep breath, summoning the courage she had been building for weeks. "About everything. About you, about Paul, about this." She gestured vaguely, struggling to find the words to describe the suffocating atmosphere that had consumed their lives. "I can't do this anymore, Barbara. I need space. I need to move on." For a moment, Barbara didn't respond. Her face was a mask, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she placed the glass down and turned to face Laura fully. "Move on," she repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "Yes," Laura said, her confidence wavering under Barbara's piercing stare. "I'm sorry if I've led you to believe otherwise, but this relationship isn't healthy. For any of us." Barbara took a step closer, and Laura instinctively stepped back. "After everything I've done for you," Barbara hissed, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and heartbreak. "After all the time we've spent together, after all the ways I've been there for you, you're just going to walk away?" "Barbara, please," Laura said, her voice breaking. "This isn't about you. It's about me. I need to do this for myself." But Barbara wasn't listening. The carefully constructed facade of composure she had maintained for months began to crack, her true emotions spilling out in a torrent. "You don't understand," she cried, her voice rising. "You're the only thing keeping me alive. I gave up everything for you, for us." Laura's fear turned to panic as Barbara's tone grew more unhinged. She tried to edge toward the door, but Barbara blocked her path, her movements erratic. "You don't mean that," Barbara said, her voice dropping to a pleading whisper. "You're just upset. You'll see. We can fix this. I can fix this." "Barbara, stop." Laura's voice was sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. "This has to end. I'm leaving, and there's nothing you can do to change that." The words hung in the air like a death knell. Barbara's expression darkened, her desperation twisting into something far more dangerous. "You can't leave," she said, her voice trembling with both fear and fury. "I won't let you." The argument escalated rapidly, voices rising as Laura tried to push past Barbara toward the door. In a moment of blind panic, Barbara grabbed the porcelain vase from the counter, its weight solid in her hands. "Don't walk away from me!" Barbara screamed, her voice raw with emotion. Laura turned, her eyes wide with fear, just as Barbara swung the vase. The sound of the impact was sickening, the crash of porcelain against flesh and bone echoing through the room. Laura crumpled to the floor, her body lifeless as blood pooled around her head. The shattered remains of the vase lay scattered around her, their jagged edges glinting under the harsh kitchen light. Barbara stood frozen, the reality of what she had done crashing down on her like a tidal wave. Her chest heaved as she stared at Laura's lifeless form, the weight of her actions sinking in. "No," she whispered, dropping to her knees beside the body. "No, no, no, this wasn't supposed to happen." For a moment, she simply sat there, paralyzed by shock and horror. Then, as if on autopilot, she began to move. She grabbed a dish towel, trying to wipe away the blood, but the stain only spread. The more she tried to clean, the messier it became. Panic consumed her, her mind racing as she realized there was no undoing what had been done. Somewhere in the distance, the clock chimed midnight, marking the end of the day, and the beginning of the nightmare that would follow. Barbara staggered to her feet, her breath ragged as she glanced at the front door. She needed time to think, to figure out what to do next. But time was running out. And as Barbara fled the scene, leaving Laura's body behind, she knew that her actions had set into motion a chain of events that would destroy everything she had tried so desperately to hold on to. The morning of September 15, 2023, began with a haunting silence in the Mitchell household. Paul Mitchell, oblivious to the horrors that had unfolded just hours before, unlocked the front door with the usual expectation of being greeted by his mother or the comforting sounds of a bustling home. Instead, he found an eerie stillness, a suffocating quiet that made his skin crawl. The sight of Laura's lifeless body in the kitchen shattered his reality. As paramedics and police officers swarmed the house, their flashing lights illuminating the quiet suburban cul-de-sac, Paul stood outside, his face pale and hands trembling. His mind raced with questions, but one loomed above all: where was his mother? Barbara Mitchell's absence quickly became a focal point of the investigation. Detectives noted the broken vase, the blood pooling beneath Laura's head, and the unmistakable signs of a struggle. They found no evidence of forced entry, a detail that immediately suggested the attack had been carried out by someone Laura knew. Paul, shaken and overwhelmed, recounted the events leading up to the discovery. He told the officers about his weekend away, about Laura's uneasy relationship with his mother, and about Barbara's increasingly erratic behavior over the past few months. It wasn't long before the detectives' interest zeroed in on Barbara. Later that afternoon, an APB, all-points bulletin, was issued for Barbara Mitchell. Calls to her cell phone went unanswered, and a search of the house revealed that her purse and car keys were missing. It appeared she had fled the scene, but not before leaving behind a trail of evidence that pointed directly to her. Inside a drawer in Barbara's bedroom, investigators found a series of handwritten letters addressed to Laura. The letters were deeply personal, their tone oscillating between adoration and despair. In one, Barbara confessed, "I don't know what I'd do if you ever left. You've become my everything." Another hinted at the tension in their relationship: "Why can't you see how much I care? Why do you keep pushing me away?" Detectives also recovered Barbara's phone from the living room. Text messages between her and Laura painted a picture of a relationship that had become increasingly strained. In the weeks leading up to Laura's death, Barbara had sent numerous late-night texts pleading for Laura to spend more time with her. One message, sent just days before the incident, read, "I can't lose you. Please don't do this to me." Meanwhile, forensic experts processed the kitchen. Blood spatter analysis confirmed that Laura had been struck with the vase, and Barbara's fingerprints were found on the shattered pieces scattered across the floor. It was clear to the investigators that this was no accident. The sheer force of the blow indicated a level of intent that aligned with the emotional volatility suggested by the letters and messages. As the evidence against Barbara mounted, Paul struggled to reconcile the woman he had known all his life with the person now accused of killing his girlfriend. He spent hours at the police station, answering questions about his mother's behavior and their family dynamics. Each answer felt like a betrayal, a weight pressing heavier on his already shattered heart. The community of Greenwood, Indiana, was equally shaken. Neighbors, who had always seen Barbara as a kind and devoted mother, struggled to comprehend the depth of her obsession. Whispers of the affair between Barbara and Laura began to circulate, fueled by the revelations uncovered during the investigation. The quiet cul-de-sac became a hub of speculation, with reporters camping outside the Mitchell home, eager for any updates. 3 days later, on September 18, 2023, Barbara was found. Her car had been spotted parked outside a budget motel 2 towns over, and when officers entered her room, they found her sitting on the bed, staring blankly at the wall. She didn't resist arrest, her expression one of resignation as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. At the police station, Barbara initially refused to speak. But under the weight of mounting evidence and relentless questioning, she broke her silence. Her voice was quiet, almost detached, as she recounted the events of that night. She insisted she hadn't meant to kill Laura, that it had been an act of desperation born from fear and heartbreak. She was leaving, Barbara murmured, tears streaming down her face. I couldn't let her leave. She was all I had left. The confession, while heartbreaking, only solidified the case against her. Barbara was charged with second-degree murder, and the weight of the accusation left Paul reeling. He couldn't bring himself to visit her in custody, his emotions a tangled mess of anger, grief, and confusion. In the weeks that followed, the Mitchell house remained eerily empty. Paul moved back to his dorm in Bloomington, unable to face the memories that clung to every corner of the home he once thought of as a sanctuary. Laura's family held a quiet funeral, and Paul attended, standing at the back of the service, too ashamed to approach her grieving parents. The investigation into Laura's death brought with it not just answers, but painful truths about the fragile bonds that had held the Mitchell family together. The once close-knit household had become a symbol of obsession, betrayal, and loss, and the tragedy left a scar on everyone it touched. For Paul, the nightmare was far from over. He knew that the trial looming ahead would dredge up every painful detail, forcing him to confront the darkest aspects of his mother's psyche, and the role he might have played in ignoring the warning signs. The courtroom was packed on a cold January morning in 2024 as the trial of Barbara Mitchell began. Reporters and curious locals filled the gallery, their hushed whispers creating a buzz of tension that hung in the air. This wasn't just a trial about a murder, it was a spectacle, the unraveling of a once respected woman whose life had descended into chaos and obsession. Barbara sat at the defense table, her once proud posture now hunched. Her face, pale and gaunt, bore the weight of sleepless nights and the guilt she could no longer deny. Across the courtroom, Paul Mitchell sat quietly, his hands clasped together as if he were holding on to the last threads of his composure. His gaze never met his mother's, he couldn't bring himself to look at her. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out their case. The lead prosecutor, a sharp and deliberate woman named Emily Carter, began her opening statement with chilling precision. This is a case about obsession, betrayal, and control. Barbara Mitchell didn't just love Laura Hayes, she sought to possess her. And when that control slipped through her fingers, she acted out of desperation, ending Laura's life. Over the next few days, the prosecution painted a vivid picture of Barbara's growing obsession with Laura. They presented the letters found in Barbara's drawer, the text messages that oscillated between pleading and manipulation, and the physical evidence tying her to the crime scene. Forensic experts detailed how the vase was wielded with enough force to be fatal, leaving no doubt that it was the weapon that ended Laura's life. The prosecution also called witnesses to the stand, including neighbors and friends who had noticed Barbara's increasingly erratic behavior. One particularly damning testimony came from Sarah Thompson, Laura's close friend, who described how Laura had confided in her about Barbara's inappropriate attention. She was scared, Sarah said, her voice trembling. Laura told me she felt trapped. She didn't know how to leave without upsetting Barbara, or Paul. As the prosecution's case built momentum, the defense worked to humanize Barbara. Her lawyer, Richard Levine, argued that Barbara was a broken woman, crushed by the weight of her failed marriage and the loneliness that followed. He described her as someone who had sought comfort in Laura's presence but had never intended for things to escalate to violence. She is not a monster, Levine said in his opening statement. Barbara Mitchell is a deeply flawed human being, yes, but she is also a mother, a woman who has lost everything, and someone who acted in a moment of blind fear and desperation. The defense called psychological experts to the stand, who testified that Barbara suffered from severe emotional distress, exacerbated by years of unresolved trauma from her marriage and her growing dependence on Laura. They argued that the act was not premeditated but a tragic consequence of a fragile mind pushed to its breaking point. The most poignant moment of the trial came when Barbara herself took the stand. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she recounted her growing attachment to Laura, her fear of abandonment, and the night everything fell apart. I wasn't thinking, she said, tears streaming down her face. I couldn't bear the thought of her leaving. She was all I had left. Her testimony was raw and unfiltered, laying bare the depths of her despair. While it didn't absolve her of her actions, it gave the courtroom a glimpse into the pain and loneliness that had driven her to the breaking point. Paul sat rigid throughout the trial, his emotions a tangled mess. He felt anger toward his mother for what she had done, guilt for not seeing the signs, and profound sadness for the lives torn apart by her actions. He listened to her testimony with a hollow ache in his chest, grappling with the realization that the woman who had raised him was capable of such devastation. After 2 weeks of intense arguments, the jury retired to deliberate. The courtroom was silent as everyone awaited the verdict, the tension so thick it was almost unbearable. On the third day, the jury returned, their faces solemn. Barbara Mitchell was found guilty of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15. The sentence was met with a mix of relief and sorrow, justice for Laura's family, but a grim end to Barbara's life as she knew it. As the bailiffs escorted Barbara out of the courtroom, she turned to Paul one last time. Their eyes met briefly, a moment that spoke volumes of regret, pain, and unspoken apologies. Paul didn't move, his face a mask of stoic grief, but his trembling hands betrayed the storm raging within. The trial left a lasting impact, not just on the Mitchell family but on the community. Conversations about mental health, obsession, and the pressures of family relationships rippled through Greenwood, prompting neighbors to reflect on the hidden struggles behind closed doors. For Paul, the trial marked the beginning of a long journey toward healing. He moved out of Greenwood, cutting ties with the house that held too many painful memories. In his solitude, he began to grapple with the lessons of the tragedy, not just the dangers of unchecked emotions but the importance of seeking help before it's too late. Barbara, now behind bars, found herself alone with her thoughts for the first time in years. She wrote letters to Paul from prison, apologizing for her actions and expressing a wish for him to find peace. While Paul couldn't bring himself to reply, he kept the letters, unsure if he would ever open them but unwilling to throw them away. The trial wasn't just about justice, it was a harsh, unflinching look at the fragility of the human mind and the devastating consequences of emotional neglect. And while the scars left by Laura's death would never fully heal, they served as a reminder to everyone who followed the case, even in the darkest moments, there is a chance for redemption, reflection, and growth. The Mitchell household in Greenwood, Indiana, stood empty in the weeks following the trial, a haunting reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded there. The curtains hung still, the walls echoed with silence, and the once bustling kitchen had become a cold, lifeless space. Paul Mitchell, now estranged from the only family he had left, couldn't bear to set foot in the house again. For Paul, the end of the trial was not the end of his pain, it was the beginning of a long, uncertain road to healing. He packed his belongings and moved to Bloomington, taking refuge in his studies and attempting to rebuild his life away from the shadows of his past. Yet, the memories clung to him like a second skin, surfacing in quiet moments: Laura's laugh, his mother's worried glances, the overwhelming stillness of the morning he found Laura's body. In his small apartment near campus, Paul began the painstaking work of processing his grief. Therapy sessions became a cornerstone of his routine, offering him a safe space to untangle the emotions he had bottled up for so long. His therapist helped him confront the guilt that weighed heavily on his heart, the guilt of missing the signs, of not protecting Laura, of not doing more to help his mother. "It wasn't your fault," the therapist told him during one particularly difficult session. "You were caught in something far beyond your control." Still, forgiveness didn't come easily for Paul. Forgiving his mother felt impossible, yet he couldn't ignore the small, nagging part of him that wanted to understand her, to believe that she had been more than her worst moment. The letters Barbara sent from prison remained unopened in a drawer, waiting for the day he might find the strength to read them. Meanwhile, Barbara adjusted to life behind bars. Prison offered her plenty of time to reflect, though the isolation often felt like a punishment more profound than the sentence itself. She spent her days writing letters to Paul, pouring out her remorse and her hope that one day he might find it in his heart to forgive her. "I was lost," she wrote in one letter. "I clung to Laura because I couldn't face the emptiness inside me. But in trying to hold on, I destroyed everything I cared about. I'm so sorry, Paul. I hope you can find peace, even if I never do." Over time, Barbara found solace in routine. She joined a prison writing group and began sharing her story with others. Her words, raw, unflinching, and deeply introspective, resonated with her fellow inmates, many of whom had their own stories of loss and regret. In helping others, Barbara found a sense of purpose, however small. For the Greenwood community, the Mitchell case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unaddressed emotional wounds. Neighbors who had once admired Barbara's poise and devotion now whispered about the darkness that had lurked beneath the surface. Yet, some saw her story as a call to action, a reminder of the importance of reaching out, of seeking help before it was too late. By the spring of 2024, Paul began to rebuild, slowly but surely. He joined a local advocacy group focused on mental health awareness, using his own experiences to educate others about the importance of addressing emotional struggles before they spiraled into tragedy. Through his work, he found a renewed sense of purpose, a way to channel his pain into something meaningful. One sunny afternoon, Paul returned to Greenwood for the first time since the trial. The house had been sold, its new occupants unaware of the weight it had once carried. Paul stood outside for a moment, staring at the front door. It no longer felt like the home he had grown up in, it was simply a house, stripped of its memories, its meaning. For the first time in months, Paul felt a strange sense of closure. The scars left by Laura's death would never fully heal, but they became a part of Paul's story, a reminder of what he had endured and how far he had come. He left Greenwood that day with a quiet resolve, to honor Laura's memory by living a life of compassion and purpose, to carry forward the lessons he had learned, and to find peace in the knowledge that even in darkness, there was a chance for rebirth. What are your thoughts on the choices made by Barbara, Paul, and Laura? Could anything have been done differently to prevent this tragedy? How do you feel about Barbara's sentence? Do you believe justice was served, or should there have been a different outcome? Have you ever experienced a situation where unspoken emotions created tension in your relationships? How did you handle it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective on this story. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping tales like this one.